The moving truck pulled away from Maple Grove Retirement Community just as the autumn rain began to fall. Dorothy Hayes stood in the lobby with a single suitcase at her feet, watching the taillights disappear down the long driveway. She was 78 years old, and this was the last place she ever wanted to be. The lobby smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A television in the corner played a game show that nobody was watching. Dorothy could hear the shuffle of slippers on linoleum, the distant ring of a call button, the low murmur of voices that all sounded tired and resigned. This was supposed to be her new home, but it felt more like a waiting room for the end of life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy had never imagined her life would end up like this. Just 2 years ago, she had been living independently in the house she and her husband Thomas had bought 40 years earlier. It was a modest 3-bedroom home in the suburbs with a garden where she grew tomatoes and roses. Thomas had died 5 years ago from cancer, and Dorothy had managed well enough on her own after that. She had her routines, her garden, her book club, her volunteer work at the library. She had friends who called her for coffee. She had a life that felt purposeful and full. Then came the diagnosis. Parkinson's disease. The doctor had been gentle but clear. Her hands would shake. Her balance would deteriorate. Eventually, she would need help with daily tasks. The medication could slow the progression, but it could not stop it. Dorothy had tried to stay in her house. She really had tried. But the tremors in her hands made cooking dangerous. She burned herself twice on the stove. She dropped a glass and cut her foot badly on the broken pieces. Her daughter Rachel, who lived 3 hours away with her own family, started calling every day with worry in her voice. Rachel had 2 teenage children and a demanding job as a hospital administrator. She could not drop everything to take care of her mother. After Dorothy fell in the bathroom and lay on the cold tile floor for 2 hours before a neighbor found her, Rachel made the decision. It was time for assisted living. Dorothy had fought against it. She did not want to leave her home, her independence, her dignity. But Rachel was insistent, and deep down, Dorothy knew her daughter was right. She could not live alone anymore. It was not safe. So here she was at Maple Grove Retirement Community. The brochures had made it look cheerful with photos of smiling seniors doing arts and crafts, playing cards, enjoying meals together. The reality was far less appealing. The building was old and institutional. The carpets were worn. The walls were painted in dull beige that seemed designed to drain any remaining vitality from the residents. A young woman with a bright, artificial smile approached Dorothy. She wore scrubs printed with cartoon cats and a name tag that read Jessica, Activities Coordinator. "Welcome to Maple Grove, Mrs. Hayes. We're so happy to have you here. Let me show you to your room." Dorothy followed Jessica down a long hallway. They passed a common room where several elderly people sat in wheelchairs, staring blankly at another television. A man with white hair called out something unintelligible. A woman was crying softly in the corner, but nobody seemed to notice or care. "This is our main gathering space," Jessica said with forced enthusiasm. "We have movie nights here on Fridays. And bingo on Wednesdays." Dorothy said nothing. She had never liked bingo. They reached room 147. Jessica unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Here we are. Your new home." The room was small and sterile. A narrow bed with a thin blue bedspread. A wooden dresser that looked like it came from a thrift store. A small closet. A window that looked out onto the parking lot. The walls were blank white. There was a bathroom attached, barely large enough to turn around in. Dorothy felt her throat tighten. This was not a home. This was a cell. "I'll let you get settled," Jessica said, still maintaining that bright smile. "Dinner is at 5 in the main dining hall. Just follow the hallway back the way we came. If you need anything, just press the call button by your bed. Someone will come help you." After Jessica left, Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. Her entire life had been reduced to this small space. The house where she had raised her daughter was gone, sold to pay for this place. Most of her furniture had been donated or thrown away. She had been allowed to bring only what would fit in this tiny room. A few clothes, some photographs, a handful of books. Everything else was gone. She thought about Thomas and wished desperately that he was still alive. He would know what to say to make this bearable. He always knew how to find the light in dark situations. But Thomas was gone, and Dorothy was alone in a place that felt like the end of everything. That first week at Maple Grove was the longest of Dorothy's life. She ate meals in the dining hall at assigned times with assigned tablemates who never spoke to her. The food was bland and overcooked. Everything tasted like cardboard. She attended the mandatory activities because the staff became concerned if residents stayed in their rooms too much. She sat through bingo games without marking her card. She watched movies she had no interest in. She participated in chair exercises led by a perky young physical therapist who talked to the elderly residents like they were children. Dorothy felt invisible. The staff members were polite but rushed, always hurrying from one resident to the next. They called her Sweetie and Honey instead of using her name. They talked about her medical conditions in front of her as if she was not there. They made decisions about her care without asking her opinion. The other residents were not much better. Some were kind but so lost in their own decline that conversation was impossible. Others were bitter and complained constantly. A few tried to be friendly, but Dorothy had no energy for making new friends. She missed her old life with an ache that felt physical. She missed her garden and her book club and her volunteer work. She missed feeling useful and needed. Here, she was just another old woman taking up space, waiting to die. Her hands shook more now. Whether it was the Parkinson's getting worse or just the stress of her new situation, she could not tell. The tremors made her self-conscious. She spilled her water at dinner. She dropped her fork. She could not button her own shirts anymore and had to ask the nursing staff for help. Each small indignity chipped away at her sense of self. Rachel visited once during that first month, staying for an awkward 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon. She brought Dorothy's grandchildren, 15-year-old Emma and 13-year-old Lucas, but the kids clearly did not want to be there. They sat on the edge of Dorothy's bed, looking at their phones, answering questions with one-word responses. "This is a nice place, Mom," Rachel said, though her eyes betrayed her doubt. "You're safe here." "The staff seems very attentive." Dorothy just nodded. What was the point of complaining? Rachel had her own life, her own problems. Dorothy would not burden her daughter with the truth of how miserable she was. After they left, Dorothy cried for the first time since arriving at Maple Grove. She pressed her face into her thin pillow so nobody in the neighboring rooms would hear her. One afternoon in her second week, Dorothy was walking slowly down the hallway, using the wall for support, when she heard something that made her stop. Music. Piano music. It was coming from somewhere nearby, faint but unmistakable. She followed the sound down a corridor she had not explored before. At the end of the hall was a set of double doors. She pushed them open and found herself in what appeared to be a multi-purpose room. There were folding chairs stacked against the walls, a small stage at one end, and in the corner, a piano. An upright piano, old and slightly battered, but a real piano nonetheless. Dorothy walked toward it slowly, drawn by something she could not name. She had not seen a piano in years. Not since Thomas died, actually. They had owned a piano once, a beautiful baby grand that sat in their living room. Dorothy had taken lessons as a child and played casually throughout her adult life. Nothing serious, just for her own enjoyment. She would play after dinner sometimes, simple pieces that made her happy. Thomas loved to listen to her play. After he died, she could not bring herself to keep the piano. Every time she looked at it, she thought of Thomas sitting in his favorite chair, eyes closed, listening to her play Chopin or Debussy. The grief was too much. She sold the piano to a young couple who promised to take good care of it. She had not played since. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now, standing in front of this old upright at Maple Grove, Dorothy felt something stir inside her. A memory, a longing, a small flicker of the person she used to be. She reached out and pressed one of the keys. The note was slightly out of tune, but it rang out clear and true. She pressed another key, then another. The sound filled the empty room. For the first time in weeks, Dorothy felt something other than despair. She felt curious. She sat down on the bench, adjusting it carefully because her balance was not what it used to be. She placed her trembling hands on the keys. She remembered, vaguely, where middle C was. She tried to play a simple scale. Her fingers stumbled and the tremor made the notes uneven, but she kept going. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. The sound transported her. Suddenly she was not in this dreary retirement home. She was in her living room with Thomas reading the newspaper nearby. She was young again, capable again, alive again. "What do you think you're doing?" The sharp voice shattered the moment. Dorothy's hands jerked away from the keys. She turned to see a staff member standing in the doorway. It was not Jessica, the activities coordinator, but someone else. A middle-aged woman with short brown hair and a stern expression. Her name tag read Brenda, facility supervisor. "I was just playing," Dorothy said softly. "Just for a moment." "That piano is not for residents to use," Brenda said, walking toward her with quick, purposeful steps. "It's facility property. We bring in a professional musician for special events. Residents are not allowed to touch it without permission." "I'm sorry," Dorothy said, standing up quickly. The sudden movement made her dizzy. "I didn't know." "Well, now you know," Brenda said. She closed the piano lid firmly, as if to emphasize her point. "You need to go back to your room or to the common area. This space is not for wandering around." Dorothy felt her face flush with embarrassment. She had not meant to break any rules. She had just wanted to touch something beautiful, to feel something other than despair. She walked toward the door, using her walker for support. As she passed Brenda, the supervisor shook her head. "You're too old to be playing around with pianos anyway," Brenda muttered, just loud enough for Dorothy to hear. Dorothy froze. The words hit her like a slap. Too old. As if her age disqualified her from experiencing joy or beauty. As if being 78 meant she had no right to music or creativity or anything beyond sitting quietly and waiting for death. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words would not come. She just kept walking, her walker squeaking on the linoleum floor. Behind her, she heard Brenda laugh and say something to another staff member who had appeared. "Can you believe that? Trying to play piano at her age with those shaky hands. That's just sad." More laughter. Dorothy walked faster, her eyes stinging with tears. She made it back to her room and closed the door behind her. She sat on her bed and stared at the blank wall. Too old. The words echoed in her mind. Too old to learn, too old to try, too old to matter. Maybe Brenda was right. Maybe at 78 with Parkinson's disease, she should just accept her limitations. Maybe wanting more than this was foolish and pathetic. That night, Dorothy could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the piano. Thinking about the way the keys had felt under her fingers, even for those few brief moments. Thinking about how alive she had felt, how present, how real. She had not felt that way in months. Not since the diagnosis. Not since losing her house. Not since coming to this place. The next morning at breakfast, Dorothy sat at her assigned table with 3 other residents. There was Agnes, a woman in her 80s who never spoke and seemed to be somewhere far away in her own mind. There was Harold, a former accountant who complained about everything from the temperature of his coffee to the government. And there was Lillian, a cheerful woman with advanced dementia who thought it was 1962 and kept asking when her husband was coming to pick her up. Dorothy ate her oatmeal in silence, listening to Harold complain about how the eggs were always rubbery at this place. Across the dining hall, she could see Brenda talking to other staff members. They were laughing about something. Dorothy wondered if they were laughing about her. After breakfast, Dorothy went back to her room. She took out an old photograph from her dresser drawer. It was a picture of her and Thomas at their daughter's wedding. Dorothy was wearing a blue dress. Thomas was in a suit. They were both smiling, genuinely happy. That was 15 years ago. She looked at the woman in the photograph and barely recognized herself. That Dorothy had been confident and capable. She had volunteered at the library, teaching children to read. She had organized the neighborhood book club. She had maintained a beautiful garden. She had played piano for fun. Where had that woman gone? When had Dorothy become this frightened, diminished version of herself? She thought about what Brenda had said. Too old to play piano. The words stung, but they also ignited something. A small spark of defiance. Who was Brenda to tell her what she was too old to do? Who was anyone to define the limits of her life? Dorothy had never been a rebellious person. She had always followed rules, respected authority, done what was expected of her. But sitting in that small room with that photograph in her shaking hands, something shifted inside her. She had already lost so much. Her husband, her health, her home, her independence. She had been pushed into this place where she did not want to be, where she was treated like she was already half dead. What more could they take from her? What did she have to lose? If she wanted to play piano, she would play piano. She did not need anyone's permission to pursue something that brought her joy. She was 78 years old, not dead. Not yet. Dorothy put the photograph back in the drawer and stood up. Her hands were shaking more than usual, but her resolve was steady. She would find a way to play that piano. She did not know how yet, but she would figure it out. Over the next few days, Dorothy observed the rhythms of Maple Grove carefully. She noticed when the staff changed shifts. She noticed when the multi-purpose room was empty. She noticed that Brenda, the facility supervisor, usually left by 4 in the afternoon. And she noticed that between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, after lunch activities but before dinner preparations, there was a window of time when the hallways were quiet and the staff was occupied elsewhere. On Thursday afternoon, Dorothy waited until the clock in her room showed 2:15. Then she grabbed her walker and made her way slowly down the hallway. Her heart was beating fast. She felt like a teenager sneaking out past curfew, which was ridiculous at her age, but there it was. She reached the double doors of the multi-purpose room and pushed them open as quietly as she could. The room was empty, exactly as she hoped. The piano sat in the corner, waiting. Dorothy walked toward it, each step deliberate. She was not doing anything wrong, she told herself. She was just an elderly woman who wanted to play piano. That should not be a crime. She sat down at the bench and opened the piano lid. The keys looked the same as they had days ago. Ivory and black, slightly yellowed with age. She placed her trembling hands in position and began to play. She started with scales again, trying to remember the patterns her childhood piano teacher had drilled into her 60 years ago. Her fingers stumbled. The tremor made it difficult to hit the right keys. Some notes came out too loud, others too soft. But she kept going. After the scales, she tried to remember an actual piece. Something simple. She chose For Elise by Beethoven, one of the first pieces she had learned as a teenager. Her muscle memory kicked in, guiding her fingers even when her conscious mind could not remember the notes. It was rough and imperfect. She made mistakes. She had to stop and start over several times. But the music, however flawed, filled the room. And for those few minutes, Dorothy was not a sick old woman in a depressing retirement home. She was just Dorothy, playing piano, connected to something beautiful and timeless. She managed about 15 minutes before she heard voices in the hallway. Panic seized her. She closed the piano lid quickly and stood up, grabbing her walker. But she was not fast enough. The door opened and 2 staff members walked in, carrying folding tables. They stopped when they saw Dorothy. "Oh, Mrs. Hayes," one of them said. It was Michael, a young nursing assistant with kind eyes. "What are you doing in here?" "I was just looking around," Dorothy said, hating how guilty she sounded. "I didn't touch anything." Michael glanced at the piano, then back at Dorothy. His expression suggested he did not quite believe her, but he did not push it. "Okay, well, we need to set up for an event this evening. You should probably head back to the common area." Dorothy nodded and walked toward the door as quickly as her walker would allow. As she left, she heard the other staff member mutter to Michael, "Was she messing with the piano?" Michael's response was too quiet for her to hear, but she imagined they were laughing at her just like Brenda had. Despite the close call, Dorothy felt exhilarated. She had done it. She had played piano again, even if only for a few minutes. And she wanted to do it again. The next day, she returned to the multi-purpose room at the same time. Again, it was empty. Again, she played. She worked on Für Elise until she could get through the first section without stopping. Her hands still shook. The notes were still uneven. But it was getting slightly better. Each day, she returned. Each day, she practiced for 15 or 20 minutes before fear of getting caught drove her away. Nobody stopped her. Nobody seemed to notice. She started to feel like maybe, just maybe, she could keep doing this. Maybe she could reclaim this one small piece of joy in her life. Then, on her 6th visit to the piano, her luck ran out. She was deep into practicing a Chopin nocturne, one she had loved in her youth, when the door burst open. Brenda, the facility supervisor, stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips and fury on her face. "I knew it," Brenda said, striding toward Dorothy. "I knew someone was using this piano without permission." Dorothy's hands froze on the keys. Her heart hammered in her chest. "I just wanted to play," Dorothy said quietly. "I wasn't hurting anything." "You are not authorized to use facility equipment," Brenda snapped. "I told you that already. Do you have memory problems? Should I have the doctor evaluate your cognitive function?" "No," Dorothy said, feeling her face burn with humiliation. "I remember." "I just thought then you deliberately disobeyed the rules," Brenda interrupted. She closed the piano lid so forcefully that Dorothy had to pull her hands away quickly to avoid getting them caught. "This behavior is unacceptable, Mrs. Hayes. You're not a child. You're 78 years old. You should know better." Dorothy stood up slowly, gripping her walker for support. "I'm sorry," she said, though part of her wanted to scream that she had nothing to be sorry for. What had she done that was so terrible? Played a piano that was sitting unused? Tried to find a moment of happiness in this miserable place? Brenda's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained stern. "Look, Mrs. Hayes, I understand you're having a hard time adjusting here. Many residents do. But we have rules for a reason. That piano is expensive. If something happened to it because a resident was unsupervised, the facility would be liable. And frankly, with your condition, your Parkinson's, you could hurt yourself. What if you fell off the bench? What if your tremors caused you to injure your hands on the keys? We have to think about safety." Dorothy wanted to argue that she was perfectly safe, that she had been playing piano for decades and knew what she was doing. But she could see that Brenda had already made up her mind. In Brenda's eyes, Dorothy was just another frail, incompetent resident who needed to be managed and controlled. "I won't come back here," Dorothy said quietly. "I promise." "Good," Brenda said. "Now, let's get you back to your room. I think you need to rest. You seem agitated." "I'm not agitated," Dorothy said, but even as she said it, she could feel tears threatening. She was not agitated. She was heartbroken. Brenda escorted Dorothy back to her room like a prison guard walking an inmate to solitary confinement. Other residents peeked out of their doorways, curious about the commotion. Dorothy kept her eyes down, mortified. When they reached room 147, Brenda opened the door and gestured for Dorothy to go inside. "I'm going to make a note in your file about this incident," Brenda said. "If there are further behavioral issues, we may need to discuss additional supervision." Additional supervision. Dorothy knew what that meant. They would watch her more closely. They would treat her like she could not be trusted. She would lose even more of the tiny amount of freedom she had left. After Brenda left, Dorothy sat on her bed and finally let the tears come. She cried for herself, for her lost life, for her lost dignity. She cried because she was 78 years old and being scolded like a naughty child. She cried because something as simple as playing piano had been taken from her, just like everything else. That evening at dinner, Dorothy noticed people staring at her. Word had clearly spread about her piano incident. Harold, her table-mate, leaned over and whispered, "I heard you got in trouble with Brenda today. Playing the piano without permission. That true?" Dorothy nodded, not trusting her voice. Harold chuckled. "You're braver than I thought, Mrs. Hayes. Brenda runs this place like a warden. Most people are too scared to cross her." "I wasn't trying to be brave," Dorothy said quietly. "I just wanted to play." "Well, you stir up some excitement," Harold said. "That's more than most of us do around here. We just sit and wait to die." The words hung in the air. Harold went back to his dinner as if he had not just spoken a terrible truth. Dorothy looked around the dining hall at all the other residents. Most of them looked exactly as Harold described. They were sitting and waiting. Waiting for meals, waiting for activities, waiting for visits that rarely came, waiting for death. Was that all her life was now? Just waiting for the end? That night, Dorothy could not sleep again. She thought about the piano. She thought about the way it felt to create music, even imperfectly. She thought about how those few minutes each day had made her feel like herself again. And she thought about Brenda's words. "You're too old. Too old to learn. Too old to try. Too old to matter." Dorothy had accepted a lot of limitations in her life. She had accepted her husband's death, even though it broke her heart. She had accepted her Parkinson's diagnosis, even though it terrified her. She had accepted moving to this retirement home, even though it felt like giving up. But she could not accept this. She could not accept being told she was too old to pursue something that brought her joy. She could not accept fading away into nothing without even trying to hold on to the parts of herself that made life worth living. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Dorothy made a decision. She would not give up on the piano. She would find another way. She did not know what that way was yet, but she would find it. Because if she gave up now, if she let Brenda and this place and her disease take this from her, then what would be left? What would be the point of being alive at all? The next morning, Dorothy asked Jessica, the activities coordinator, if there was a music store anywhere nearby. Jessica looked surprised by the question but pulled out her phone and searched. "There's one about 2 miles away," she said. "Harmony Music Shop." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Dorothy said, not wanting to explain. "Can residents go there? Like, can we leave the facility?" Jessica's enthusiasm returned. "Oh yes. Residents are free to come and go as they please, as long as they're mobile and sign out at the front desk. We encourage independence. Do you need transportation?" Dorothy thought about this. She had not driven in over a year. Her doctor had advised her to stop after her tremors became too severe. But the bus system still ran through town, and there was a stop right outside Maple Grove. "I can manage," Dorothy said. That afternoon, Dorothy signed out at the front desk, telling the receptionist she was going for a walk. It was not exactly a lie. She was walking to the bus stop. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer. The bus ride took 20 minutes. Dorothy had not been on public transportation in years, and she felt nervous navigating it with her walker, but the driver was patient and helped her find a seat. Harmony Music Shop was small and cramped, filled with guitars hanging on walls, keyboards stacked in corners, and shelves of sheet music. A young man with multiple earrings and a band t-shirt looked up when Dorothy entered. "Can I help you find something?" he asked. Dorothy had rehearsed what she would say on the bus. "I'm looking for something that could help me practice piano. Like a keyboard maybe. Something not too expensive." The young man, whose name tag read Tyler, led her to a section with electronic keyboards. These range from about $100 to $500, depending on features. "Do you need full-sized keys? Weighted keys?" Dorothy had no idea what weighted keys meant, but she did not want to appear ignorant. "I need something simple," she said. "Just to practice. I'm 78 and I have Parkinson's, so my hands shake. I need something forgiving." Tyler's expression changed from sales clerk to genuinely interested. "My grandmother has Parkinson's," he said. "She struggles with a lot of things, but she still paints. Says it helps her feel human." Dorothy felt a wave of emotion at his understanding. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." Tyler showed her a keyboard that was on sale for $120. It had 61 keys, built-in speakers, and a headphone jack. "It's basic but good quality," he said. "And the keys are touch-sensitive, so you don't need a lot of hand strength." Dorothy looked at the price tag. She had some money. Not much, but some. Her Social Security check went mostly toward paying for Maple Grove, but she had a small amount left over each month. She had been saving it, though she was not sure what for. Now she knew. "I'll take it," she said. Tyler helped her carry it to the checkout counter. He also suggested she buy a beginner's piano book, which added another $15 to the total. When Dorothy pulled out her credit card, her hand was shaking so badly that Tyler had to help her insert it into the reader. "You're going to do great," he said encouragingly. "Just practice a little bit every day. That's what my grandmother does with her painting. Some days are harder than others, but she keeps going." "Thank you," Dorothy said, meaning it deeply. Tyler helped her get the keyboard box onto the bus. The driver helped her get it off at her stop. She managed to push it on a luggage cart she borrowed from the Maple Grove lobby, and slowly, painstakingly, she wheeled it down the hallway to her room. Other residents stared. A staff member asked if she needed help, but Dorothy declined. This was something she needed to do herself. Once inside her room with the door closed, Dorothy opened the box with hands that shook from both Parkinson's and excitement. The keyboard was lighter than she expected. She set it up on her dresser, plugged it in, and put on the headphones. Then she turned it on. The power light glowed green. She pressed a key. Through the headphones, she heard a perfect piano note. It was slightly artificial, not quite the same as a real piano, but it was close enough. Close enough that it made her smile. Close enough that it made her feel like she had won a small but significant victory. She could practice now. Every day, as much as she wanted. Nobody could stop her. Nobody could tell her she was too old. She played for an hour that first day, working through the beginner's book Tyler had sold her. It was designed for children, which was slightly embarrassing, but it helped her remember fundamentals she had forgotten. Hand position, fingering, rhythm, note reading. Her hands shook and she made plenty of mistakes, but that did not matter. What mattered was that she was playing. What mattered was that she had reclaimed this piece of herself. Over the following weeks, Dorothy practiced every day. Sometimes for 30 minutes, sometimes for 2 hours, depending on how her hands were doing. She kept the keyboard on her dresser and used the headphones so nobody would hear. It became her secret. Her rebellion. Her private joy in a place that offered very little joy. She progressed through the beginner's book faster than she expected. Muscle memory from her youth returned. Her fingers remembered patterns even when her conscious mind did not. She moved on to more complex pieces. She ordered new sheet music online and had it delivered to the facility. Dorothy started to look forward to waking up each morning. She had a purpose now. She had something to work toward. During meals and activities, she would think about what she would practice later. Which piece she would tackle, which section she would master. The piano gave structure to her days. It gave her something to care about. And slowly, gradually, she started to feel less like a person waiting to die and more like a person who was still living. One afternoon, she was so absorbed in practicing that she did not hear the knock on her door. She did not notice it open. She was wearing her headphones, deep into playing a Chopin prelude, when a hand tapped her shoulder. Dorothy jumped and spun around, yanking off her headphones. Standing behind her was Agnes, her table-mate from the dining hall. The elderly woman who never spoke, who always seemed lost in her own world. Agnes was staring at the keyboard with an expression Dorothy had never seen on her face before. Something like wonder. "I heard music," Agnes said quietly. Her voice was raspy from misuse. "I thought I was imagining it, but I followed the sound to your room. You play beautifully." Dorothy was too shocked to respond at first. In all the weeks she had known Agnes, the woman had never spoken a single word. "I didn't think anyone could hear through the headphones," Dorothy said. "They're not very good headphones," Agnes said with a small smile. "The sound leaks. I have the room next door. I've been listening to you practice every day for weeks." Dorothy felt her face flush. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "No," Agnes said quickly. "Please don't apologize. It's the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." She looked at Dorothy with sudden intensity. "My husband was a musician. He played violin in an orchestra. I loved listening to him practice. He died 8 years ago. Since then, I haven't heard live music. Not like this. Real music that someone is creating with their own hands. It made me feel like he was still here." The two women looked at each other. Dorothy saw that Agnes had tears in her eyes. "I thought you didn't talk," Dorothy said gently. "I don't usually," Agnes admitted. "What's the point? Nobody here cares what I have to say. The staff treats us like we're not really people anymore. Just bodies to be fed and medicated and kept alive. It's easier to stay quiet. But your music," she paused. "It woke something up in me. Something I thought was dead." Dorothy felt her own tears coming. She gestured to the chair by her bed. "Would you like to sit and listen? I was just about to practice some more." Agnes sat down with a grateful expression. Dorothy put the keyboard's audio through its small built-in speaker instead of the headphones so Agnes could hear properly. Then she began to play. She chose pieces she thought Agnes might like. A Bach prelude. A Schubert impromptu. A Brahms intermezzo. Gentle, beautiful pieces that filled her small room with sound. Agnes sat perfectly still, listening with her eyes closed. When Dorothy finished, Agnes opened her eyes and wiped them. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what that meant to me." After that day, Agnes became Dorothy's regular visitor. Every afternoon, she would knock softly on Dorothy's door, and Dorothy would play for her. Sometimes they talked afterward. Agnes shared stories about her late husband, about the life she had before Maple Grove. Dorothy talked about Thomas, about their daughter, about the house with the garden. They became friends. Real friends. The kind who understood each other's pain and loneliness. The kind who reminded each other that they were still human beings with thoughts and feelings and memories. One day, Harold from the dining table saw Agnes coming out of Dorothy's room. He stopped her in the hallway. "What's going on in there?" he asked, nodding toward Dorothy's door. "I see you going in there every afternoon." Agnes hesitated, protective of their secret. "Dorothy plays piano," she said finally. "It's beautiful." Harold's eyebrows went up. "Really? Can anyone listen?" Agnes looked back at Dorothy's door, then at Harold. "I don't know. You would have to ask her." That evening at dinner, Harold leaned over to Dorothy. "Agnes tells me you play piano," he said. "That true?" Dorothy felt nervous. She had wanted to keep this private. But Agnes was nodding encouragingly from across the table. Yes, Dorothy admitted. I practice in my room. Harold looked impressed. I didn't know you had that in you, Mrs. Hayes. Would you play something for me sometime? I used to love piano music. My mother played. When I was a kid. Dorothy could not think of a reason to refuse. The next afternoon, both Agnes and Harold came to her room. Dorothy played for them. Harold listened with his eyes fixed on the keyboard, transported back to his childhood. When she finished, he cleared his throat roughly. That was something, he said. Really something. Words spread quietly among the residents. Not to the staff, who remained oblivious, but among the elderly people who lived in that wing of Maple Grove. Within 2 weeks, Dorothy had a regular audience of 5 people who came to her room each afternoon to listen to her practice. There was Agnes and Harold. There was Lillian, who still thought it was 1962 but who smiled and clapped her hands to the music. Dorothy's small room had become a sanctuary for 6 residents who gathered there every afternoon at 2 o'clock. They squeezed into the tight space, sitting on her bed, on the single chair, some even standing by the dresser where the keyboard sat. Dorothy would play for 45 minutes while her audience listened in silence, transported by the music to memories of better times. Frank, the former engineer, started bringing a small notebook where he would write down the names of the pieces Dorothy played. He created lists organized by composer and told her which ones were his favorites. Margaret, a retired schoolteacher who walked with 2 canes, began attending after hearing the music drift down the hallway one day. She would mouth the words to songs she remembered from her youth, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The gatherings became the highlight of everyone's day. For that brief time, they were not just residents of a depressing facility waiting out their final years. They were an audience experiencing art. They were people with culture and taste and appreciation for beauty. They were alive. Dorothy felt transformed by their attention and gratitude. Playing for them gave her practice sessions a greater purpose. She was not just maintaining a skill or fighting against her disease. She was bringing joy to others who desperately needed it. She started choosing her repertoire carefully, asking her audience what they wanted to hear. Harold requested jazz standards from the 1940s, so Dorothy found simplified arrangements and learned them. Agnes loved Chopin, so Dorothy worked through his nocturnes and preludes. Margaret asked for old hymns that reminded her of church, so Dorothy played them even though they were not her favorite. The residents tried to keep their afternoon gatherings quiet, but eventually, the inevitable happened. One of the nursing assistants, a young woman named Keisha, walked past Dorothy's room during a session and heard the music and voices inside. She opened the door without knocking and found 6 elderly residents crammed into the small space, all focused on Dorothy at the keyboard. "What's going on in here?" Keisha asked, her eyes wide with surprise. "We're listening to music," Harold said defensively. "There's no rule against that." Keisha looked uncertain. She was newer to the staff and clearly unsure whether this violated any policies. "How long has this been happening?" "A few weeks," Dorothy admitted, her hands still resting on the keyboard. "We weren't bothering anyone." Keisha chewed her lip, thinking. Then she surprised them all by smiling. "That's actually really cool," she said. "Can I listen for a minute?" Dorothy, emboldened by Keisha's friendly response, began playing again. She chose a Billy Joel song, something more contemporary that Keisha might recognize. The young woman leaned against the doorframe, nodding along to the melody. When Dorothy finished, Keisha clapped enthusiastically. "Mrs. Hayes, that was amazing. I had no idea you could play like that." "Thank you," Dorothy said, feeling a warm glow of pride. Keisha glanced at the residents gathered in the room. "You all really like this, huh?" "We love it," Agnes said firmly. "It's the best part of our day." Keisha nodded slowly. "Okay, well, I won't say anything to Brenda about this. She would probably have a fit about too many people in one room or some safety concern. But between us, I think it's great. You all should be able to enjoy music." After Keisha left, the group released a collective breath of relief. That was close, Harold muttered. But at least some of the staff are on our side. Young Keisha seems to have a heart. The daily concerts continued for another 3 weeks without incident. Dorothy's playing improved steadily despite the tremor in her hands. She learned to work with the Parkinson's rather than fight against it, adapting her technique to accommodate the shaking. She focused on pieces that did not require rapid, precise movements and instead emphasized emotion and expression. Her audience did not care about technical perfection. They cared about feeling something, about being moved, about remembering what it was like to experience beauty. Dorothy gave them that. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was a Tuesday, overcast and dreary outside. Dorothy's audience had assembled as usual. She was midway through playing Claire de Lune when the door suddenly burst open. Brenda, the facility supervisor, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and fury blazing in her eyes. "What in God's name is going on in here?" she demanded. Everyone froze. Dorothy's hands stilled on the keys. The residents looked at each other nervously, like children caught doing something forbidden. "I asked a question," Brenda said, stepping into the room. Her voice was dangerously quiet now. "Mrs. Hayes, are you running unauthorized gatherings in your room?" "We're just listening to music," Dorothy said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's nothing wrong with that." Brenda's eyes swept the crowded room. "There are 6 people crammed into a space designed for 1. That's a fire code violation. And you're using electronic equipment that hasn't been inspected by our maintenance staff. That's a safety violation." Her gaze landed on the keyboard. "Where did you even get that?" "I bought it," Dorothy said. "With my own money." "It's mine." Brenda's jaw tightened. Residents are required to get approval before bringing in any electronic devices. "Did you fill out the proper forms? Did you have this inspected?" "No," Dorothy admitted. "I didn't know I needed to." "Ignorance is not an excuse," Brenda said. She looked at the other residents. "All of you need to return to your rooms immediately. This gathering is over." Nobody moved. Harold spoke up, his voice defiant. "We have a right to socialize. We have a right to listen to music. The facility handbook says residents are encouraged to form friendships and engage in activities. That's exactly what we're doing." Brenda's face flushed red. "You have a right to do those things in appropriate spaces under appropriate supervision. You do not have the right to create fire hazards and violate safety protocols. Now, everyone leave. Now." Slowly, reluctantly, the residents began filing out of the room. Agnes squeezed Dorothy's shoulder as she passed. Margaret whispered, "Don't let her take your keyboard." Harold was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway to glare at Brenda. "You're making a mistake," he said. "She's not hurting anyone." Brenda ignored him and closed the door once everyone was gone. Then she turned to face Dorothy alone. The expression on her face was a mixture of anger and something else. Satisfaction, maybe. Like she had been waiting for this moment. "Mrs. Hayes," Brenda said, walking toward the keyboard. "I warned you about this kind of behavior. I specifically told you that you were not to use the piano in the multi-purpose room. So what did you do? You went out and bought your own piano to use in secret. That shows a pattern of deliberate rule-breaking and disregard for facility policies." "I wasn't breaking any rules," Dorothy protested. "I checked the handbook. There's nothing that says I can't have a keyboard in my room or that I can't invite friends to listen." Brenda picked up the keyboard manual that was sitting on the dresser and flipped through it dismissively. "This device needs to be inspected by our maintenance department to ensure it meets electrical safety standards. Until that happens, I'm confiscating it." "You can't do that," Dorothy said, alarm rising in her chest. "It's my property. I have every right to confiscate anything that poses a potential safety risk to residents or the facility," Brenda said. She unplugged the keyboard and began wrapping the cord around it. "This will be returned to you if and when it passes inspection." But given the backlog in our maintenance department, that could take weeks. Maybe months. Dorothy felt panic clawing at her throat. That keyboard was her lifeline. It was the one thing that made this place bearable. Without it, she would sink back into the despair and hopelessness she had felt when she first arrived. "Please," Dorothy said, hating how her voice trembled. "Please don't take it. I need it. I'll follow whatever rules you want. I'll fill out forms. I'll get it inspected. Just please don't take it away." Brenda paused, the keyboard in her arms. She looked at Dorothy with an expression that might have been pity but felt more like condescension. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand you're bored here. I understand you're looking for ways to occupy your time. But you need to understand that you're not in your own home anymore. You're in a care facility with rules and regulations designed to keep everyone safe. You don't get to just do whatever you want whenever you want." "I'm 78, not 5, Dorothy said, surprising herself with the sharpness in her voice. "I don't need you to treat me like a child who can't be trusted with her own belongings." Brenda's expression hardened again. The pity, if that's what it was, vanished. When you act like a child by repeatedly breaking rules, then you'll be treated accordingly. She walked toward the door with the keyboard. "The inspection will take as long as it takes. In the meantime, I suggest you participate in the organized activities we provide. Jessica works very hard to create programming for residents. Maybe if you engaged with those activities instead of isolating yourself and creating problems, you would be happier here." After Brenda left, Dorothy sank onto her bed and stared at the empty space on her dresser where the keyboard had been. The room felt hollow and lifeless. She felt hollow and lifeless. All the progress she had made over the past weeks, all the joy and purpose she had found, had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. She thought about following Brenda and demanding her keyboard back. She thought about calling her daughter Rachel and asking her to intervene. But what was the point? Rachel had chosen this place. Rachel believed Dorothy was safe and well cared for here. She would not understand why a keyboard mattered so much. She would probably side with the facility supervisor who was just doing her job and keeping residents safe. That evening at dinner, Dorothy's tablemates were subdued. Even Harold, usually so quick with complaints and commentary, was quiet. Finally, Agnes leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay?" Dorothy shook her head. She did not trust herself to speak without crying. After dinner, Dorothy returned to her room and closed the door. She looked at the empty dresser and felt the weight of despair settling over her again like a heavy blanket. This was what her life was now. This was all it would ever be. A small room, bland food, meaningless activities, and staff members who treated her like she was incompetent and invisible. She sat on her bed and picked up the photograph of herself and Thomas at their daughter's wedding. She traced Thomas's face with her finger. "What would you tell me to do?" She whispered to the photograph. "How would you help me find hope right now?" But Thomas was gone, and the photograph offered no answers. Dorothy lay down on her bed fully clothed and closed her eyes. She did not want to be awake anymore. She did not want to feel this crushing disappointment and anger. Sleep was the only escape available to her. She did not attend the next day's activities. She stayed in her room, lying on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Keisha, the young nursing assistant who had been kind about the music sessions, knocked on her door around lunchtime. "Mrs. Hayes? Are you coming to lunch?" "No thank you," Dorothy said without moving. "I'm not hungry." Keisha pushed the door open and came inside. She looked at Dorothy with concern. "Are you okay? You've been in here all morning." Dorothy did not answer. Keisha sat down on the edge of the bed. "I heard what happened yesterday. About Brenda taking your keyboard. That sucks. I'm sorry." "It doesn't matter," Dorothy said flatly. "Nothing matters." "Hey, don't say that," Keisha said gently. "I know things seem bad right now, but Brenda can't keep your keyboard forever. Once it's inspected, you'll get it back." Dorothy finally turned her head to look at Keisha. She saw genuine concern in the young woman's face, but also naivety. Keisha did not understand how places like this worked. She did not understand that people like Brenda held all the power and people like Dorothy had none. That keyboard will sit in storage for months, Dorothy said. Maybe years. Brenda will forget about it or claim it got lost. I'll never see it again. That's what happens here. They take away everything that matters until you're just an empty shell waiting to die. Keisha looked stricken. It's not like that. We care about you. The staff cares about all the residents. Do you? Dorothy asked, not unkindly. Do you really see us as people? Or are we just tasks to complete? Medications to distribute, meals to serve, beds to change? When was the last time anyone asked me what I want or what makes me happy? When was the last time anyone treated me like my thoughts and feelings matter? Keisha opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She could not answer because they both knew the truth. I'm sorry, Keisha said finally. You're right. We don't always treat residents like individuals. We get busy and overwhelmed, and it's easier to just go through the motions. But that's not right. You deserve better. Words are easy, Dorothy said, turning back to stare at the ceiling. Actions are what matter. After Keisha left, Dorothy continued lying on her bed. She did not go to dinner that night. She did not go to breakfast the next morning. She had no appetite, no energy, no motivation to do anything. The depression that had lifted during her weeks of playing piano came crashing back with twice the force. On the second day of Dorothy's self-imposed isolation, Agnes knocked on her door. When Dorothy did not answer, Agnes came in anyway. She sat in the chair by Dorothy's bed and did not say anything for a long time. Finally, she spoke. You can't give up. Dorothy did not respond. I mean it, Agnes continued. I know it feels impossible right now. I know Brenda took something precious from you. But you can't let her win. You can't let this place break you. It's too late, Dorothy said. I'm already broken. No, you're not, Agnes said firmly. Broken people don't learn to play piano again at 78 with Parkinson's disease. Broken people don't bring joy to others the way you brought joy to all of us these past weeks. You are strong, Dorothy. Stronger than you think. Dorothy finally turned to look at Agnes. The older woman's eyes were fierce with determination. Why do you care? Dorothy asked. Why does it matter to you whether I give up or not? Because you woke me up, Agnes said simply. Before I started listening to you play, I was already dead inside. I was just waiting for my body to catch up with my spirit. But your music reminded me what it feels like to be alive. It reminded me that beauty still exists in the world. If you give up now, then I'll lose that again. We'll all lose it. Harold, Margaret, Frank, Lillian. All of us. You're not just playing for yourself, Dorothy. You're playing for all of us. The words hit Dorothy hard. She had been so focused on her own loss that she had not considered how her withdrawal affected the others. They had been counting on her. They had found hope and purpose in those afternoon gatherings, just as she had. I don't have my keyboard anymore, Dorothy said. How can I play without it? Agnes smiled slightly. Where there's a will, there's a way. That's what my husband used to say. We just need to figure out what the way is. Over the next few days, Dorothy's small group of friends rallied around her. They visited her room, brought her food from the dining hall when she would not go herself, and most importantly, they schemed. Harold was the one who came up with the idea. They were all squeezed into Dorothy's room again, though this time without music. Just talking. The facility has a piano in the multi-purpose room, Harold said. We all know that. Brenda says residents can't use it, but what if we challenge that rule? On what grounds? Dorothy asked. She appreciated their support but could not see how they could possibly win against Brenda's authority. On the grounds that the piano is just sitting there unused, Harold said. It's a waste of a resource. If the facility is going to have a piano, It should be available for residents who can play it. That's common sense. Brenda will never agree to that, Dorothy said. She already made it clear she thinks I'm too old and too sick to play. Then we go over her head, Frank suggested. He had been quiet through most of the discussion, but now he leaned forward with intensity. Every facility has a management structure. Brenda answers to someone. We find out who that is and we make our case to them. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. We could write a petition. Get other residents to sign it. Show that there's real interest in having access to the piano. We could present it to whoever is in charge. Dorothy felt a flutter of something in her chest. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. You would all do that for me? She asked. We're not doing it just for you, Agnes said. We're doing it for all of us. You started something here, Dorothy. You created a community. You reminded us that we're still people with interests and desires. That matters. We're not going to let Brenda take that away without a fight. The group spent the next hour planning their strategy. Frank, with his engineering background and methodical mind, volunteered to research the facility's organizational structure. Harold, who had been a lawyer before retiring, offered to draft the petition and make sure the language was appropriate. Margaret said she would circulate the petition among residents and gather signatures. Agnes would help Dorothy prepare what to say if they got a meeting with upper management. Over the next week, the plan came together. Frank discovered that Maple Grove Retirement Community was owned by a larger corporation called Eldercare Solutions. The facility director was a woman named Patricia Vance who split her time between Maple Grove and 2 other facilities in the region. She visited Maple Grove every Thursday for administrative meetings. Harold drafted a petition that was professional and compelling. It outlined the benefits of music therapy for elderly residents, cited studies about cognitive function and emotional well-being, and respectfully requested that the piano in the multi-purpose room be made available for resident use under reasonable supervision. Margaret took the petition door to door, visiting every resident in the facility who was cognitively aware enough to understand what they were signing. She collected 42 signatures, which was more than half of the facility's resident population. Even residents who had never attended Dorothy's private concerts signed, moved by Margaret's passionate explanation of what was at stake. When Thursday came, the group was ready. They had requested a meeting with Patricia Vance through the front desk, explaining that multiple residents wanted to discuss facility policies. The receptionist, looking slightly bewildered by this unprecedented show of resident activism, had agreed to pass the message along. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Dorothy, Agnes, Harold, Frank, and Margaret sat in the facility's small conference room waiting nervously. Dorothy's hands were shaking worse than usual. She did not know if it was the Parkinson's or anxiety or both. Patricia Vance arrived 10 minutes late. She was a woman in her 50s with short blonde hair, a business suit, and an air of permanent hurry. She carried a tablet and a coffee cup and looked like she had a dozen other places she needed to be. Good afternoon, Patricia said, sitting down across from them. I understand you wanted to discuss some concerns. Before we start, I want you to know I only have about 20 minutes before my next meeting. We'll be brief, Harold said. He was clearly taking the lead as their spokesperson. We're here to talk about access to the piano in the multi-purpose room. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. The piano? Yes, Harold continued. Several residents, including Mrs. Hayes here, would like permission to use it. Currently, facility supervisor Brenda Carson has told residents they're not allowed to touch it. We believe this policy is unnecessarily restrictive and potentially detrimental to resident well-being. Patricia looked at Dorothy for the first time. Mrs. Hayes, is it? Do you play piano? I do, Dorothy said, forcing her voice to stay steady. I've been playing since I was a child. I'm not a professional, but I'm competent. I find it very therapeutic, especially given my Parkinson's diagnosis. Music therapy is a recognized treatment modality. Patricia nodded slowly, her expression neutral. I see. And what exactly are you requesting? We're requesting that the piano be made available for resident use during specified hours, Harold said. He slid the petition across the table. 42 residents have signed this document supporting the request. That's more than half our population here. Patricia picked up the petition and skimmed it. Her expression remained unreadable. Frank spoke up, his engineer's mind presenting logical arguments. The piano currently sits unused except for occasional special events. Making it available to residents would increase the facility's amenities without any additional cost. It could even be a selling point when marketing the facility to prospective residents and their families. Margaret added her perspective as a former teacher. Music has profound benefits for elderly people. It stimulates memory, reduces anxiety, provides social connection. By allowing residents to use the piano, you'd be enhancing the quality of care here. Patricia set down the petition and looked at each of them in turn. These are valid points, she said. But I imagine there are reasons why Supervisor Carson restricted access. Safety concerns, perhaps? Liability issues? She says the piano is expensive and could be damaged, Dorothy said. And she says my tremors make it dangerous for me to play. But I've been playing on my own keyboard for weeks without any problems until she confiscated it. Patricia's eyebrows rose again. She confiscated your personal property? Yes, Dorothy said. She claimed it needed to be inspected by maintenance for electrical safety. That was over a week ago, and I haven't gotten it back. Patricia made a note on her tablet. That's concerning. Personal property shouldn't be confiscated without proper procedure. Let me look into that. As for the piano, I need to consider this carefully. There are legitimate concerns about liability and safety that I can't dismiss out of hand. But I also recognize the value of providing meaningful activities for residents. The group exchanged glances. This was not an outright rejection, which was more than they had dared hope for. What if we proposed a trial period? Harold suggested. Mrs. Hayes could use the piano for 1 hour per day under supervision. If there are any problems, any damage or safety incidents, then the privilege could be revoked. But if it goes well, it could become a permanent policy. Patricia considered this. Who would supervise? I could, Agnes offered. Several of us could take turns. We'd make sure nobody else interfered or caused problems. Patricia tapped her pen against her tablet, thinking. Finally, she nodded. All right. Here's what I'm willing to do. Mrs. Hayes, I'll authorize you to use the piano in the multi-purpose room for 1 hour each afternoon, from 2 to 3 o'clock. Jessica, our activities coordinator, will be responsible for supervision. You'll need to sign a waiver acknowledging that you're using the piano at your own risk. This will be a 30-day trial. At the end of 30 days, I'll evaluate how it's going and decide whether to continue or terminate the arrangement. The group erupted in smiles and quiet exclamations of victory. Thank you, Dorothy said, relief flooding through her. Thank you so much. Patricia stood up, signaling the meeting was over. I'll speak to Supervisor Carson about this. And Mrs. Hayes, I'll also make sure your keyboard is returned to you by tomorrow. There's no reason it should still be in storage if it's your personal property. She gathered her things and headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. You know, this is the first time in my 3 years overseeing this facility that residents have organized and advocated for themselves like this. It's refreshing. More people should speak up about what they need. Don't let anyone tell you you're too old to have opinions or make requests. After Patricia left, the group sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then Harold started laughing. We did it, he said. We actually did it. Dorothy felt tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears this time. Tears of gratitude and relief and something that felt almost like joy. Thank you, she said to her friends. Thank you all so much. I couldn't have done this alone. That's the point, Agnes said, reaching over to squeeze Dorothy's hand. None of us can do anything alone. But together, we're stronger than we think. The next afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, Dorothy sat down at the piano in the multi-purpose room. Jessica, the activities coordinator, was there as promised, sitting in the back with a clipboard and a smile. A crowd had gathered. Not just Dorothy's small group of regular listeners, but dozens of other residents who had heard about the victory and wanted to see Dorothy play. Some came in wheelchairs. Some used walkers. Some walked slowly but steadily. They filled the folding chairs that had been set up. They lined the walls. They created an audience that was larger than Dorothy had ever played for in her life. She looked at all of them and felt overwhelmed. These were her people. Her community. They had fought for her right to do this, and now they were here to support her. Dorothy took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. They were shaking, but that was okay. She had learned to work with the tremor instead of fighting it. She began to play. She chose the same piece she had played that desperate night weeks ago when she had first discovered this piano. Für Elise by Beethoven. But this time, it sounded different. Stronger. More confident. More filled with emotion and meaning. She played the familiar melody, and memories flooded through her. Memories of learning this piece as a teenager, of playing it at her first recital, of teaching it to her daughter Rachel when Rachel had briefly taken piano lessons. But also newer memories. Memories of practicing in secret on her keyboard. Memories of her small audience crammed into her room. Memories of finding purpose and community in this unlikely place. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory clapping, but genuine enthusiastic applause. People were standing. Some were crying. Dorothy stood and bowed slightly, feeling more alive than she had in years. She looked at Agnes, who was beaming with pride. She looked at Harold, who was wiping his eyes behind his glasses. She looked at all the faces turned toward her with appreciation and joy. This was what she had been missing. Not just the act of playing piano, but the connection it created. The way music could reach across the barriers of age and illness and isolation to remind people of their shared humanity. For the next hour, Dorothy played piece after piece. She took requests from the audience. Someone asked for Moon River, and she played it. Someone else wanted The Way We Were, and she played that too. She played hymns and jazz standards and classical pieces. She played until her hands ached and her back was stiff from sitting on the bench. And through it all, the audience stayed. They listened. They remembered. They felt. When 3 o'clock came and her hour was up, Jessica approached with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes, but we need to wrap up. Those are the terms of the trial period." Dorothy nodded, understanding. She stood up from the piano bench, and the audience applauded again. Several people came up to thank her personally. An old man who had not spoken to her before grasped her hand and said, "You made me remember my wedding day. My wife and I danced to that song you played. She's been gone 20 years, but for a moment, I could see her again. Thank you." A woman in a wheelchair told Dorothy that she used to sing in a church choir before her stroke. Hearing the hymns made her feel close to God again in a way she had not felt since coming to Maple Grove. Person after person shared what the music had meant to them. Dorothy listened to each one, overwhelmed by the impact of what she had done. She had thought she was just playing piano. But she had been doing so much more. She had been healing wounds, sparking memories, creating connection. She had been showing everyone, including herself, that they still mattered. That night, Dorothy returned to her room to find her keyboard sitting on her dresser, exactly where it had been before Brenda confiscated it. There was a note attached in Patricia Vance's handwriting. "Mrs. Hayes, I apologize for the delay in returning your property. This should never have been taken in the first place. Thank you for bringing this matter to my attention. Keep playing. Patricia Vance, Facility Director." Dorothy sat on her bed holding the note and crying. Not from sadness this time, but from gratitude and relief in the profound realization that things could change. That she could change them. That her voice and her needs and her desires still mattered despite her age and her illness and her circumstances. The 30-day trial period turned into a permanent arrangement. Every afternoon at 2 o'clock, Dorothy played piano in the multi-purpose room. The audiences varied in size depending on the day and what else was happening at the facility, but there were always at least a dozen people there. Always people who needed to hear music, to feel something, to remember that beauty still existed. Dorothy's playing continued to improve. The daily practice strengthened her fingers and improved her technique. She learned to adapt pieces to work with her limitations rather than fighting against them. She discovered that emotional expression mattered more than technical perfection, and her audiences agreed. They did not care if she hit every note perfectly. They cared about feeling moved. Word spread beyond Maple Grove about the elderly woman with Parkinson's who played piano at the retirement home. A local newspaper heard about the story and sent a reporter. The resulting article, titled "Local Resident Proves You're Never Too Old to Make Music," featured a photo of Dorothy at the piano surrounded by her audience. It talked about her struggle to maintain her dignity and purpose in assisted living, about the community that had rallied around her, about the transformative power of music. The article was picked up by other regional papers. Then a television station contacted Patricia Vance asking to do a human interest segment. Patricia, recognizing good publicity when she saw it, agreed. The news crew came to Maple Grove on a Tuesday afternoon and filmed Dorothy's concert. They interviewed residents about what the music meant to them. They interviewed Patricia about the facility's commitment to resident well-being and quality of life. They even interviewed Brenda, who had no choice but to smile stiffly and say supportive things about Dorothy's talent while the cameras rolled. Dorothy was mortified by the attention at first. She had not started playing piano to become famous or get attention. She had done it because she needed it, because it kept her connected to who she was. But Agnes convinced her to cooperate with the media. "This isn't about you seeking attention," Agnes said. "This is about showing other people that life doesn't end at 70 or 80 or 90. That we can still learn, still grow, still contribute. Your story gives hope to people who think they're too old or too sick or too limited to pursue their passions. That's worth sharing." The television segment aired on a Friday evening. Dorothy did not watch it herself because her room did not have a television, but dozens of residents gathered in the common room to see it. The segment was 5 minutes long and beautifully edited. It showed Dorothy playing, showed the emotion on the faces of her audience, showed the community that had formed around the music. The reporter's voiceover talked about ageism in society and the importance of treating elderly people with dignity and respect. The segment ended with Dorothy saying, in a sound bite they had captured during the interview, "I'm 78 years old with Parkinson's disease, and I'm still learning and growing. Age is just a number. What matters is whether you still have passion for something. Whether you still have something to contribute. I do. And I'm not ready to stop yet." The segment went viral online. Within days, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times on social media. Dorothy started receiving letters from people all over the country. Some were from other elderly people thanking her for inspiring them to pursue dormant hobbies or interests. Some were from younger people saying that Dorothy had changed how they viewed aging and the elderly. Some were from fellow Parkinson's patients who found hope in her example. One letter came from a woman in Oregon who wrote, "I am 69 years old and was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's. I have been in despair, feeling like my life is over. Then I saw your story and realized that I still have so much living to do. Thank you for showing me that this disease doesn't have to define me or limit me. You've given me courage to keep going." Another letter came from a teenage girl who wrote, "My grandmother lives in a nursing home and I hate visiting her because it's so depressing. Everyone there seems half dead already. But after seeing your story, I realize there's still real people with feelings and interests and things they're capable of. I'm going to visit my grandmother more often and actually talk to her like she's a person instead of just going through the motions. Thank you for opening my eyes." Dorothy read every letter, overwhelmed by the impact her story had on strangers. She had simply wanted to play piano. She had not set out to inspire anyone or change anyone's perspective. But apparently, she had done both. Rachel, Dorothy's daughter, called after seeing the television segment online. "Mom, I had no idea," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea you were so unhappy when you first got there. I had no idea you were struggling so much. Why didn't you tell me?" Dorothy had to think about how to answer that. "Because you have your own life, Rachel. Your own problems and responsibilities. I didn't want to burden you with my unhappiness." "But I should have known," Rachel said. "I should have paid more attention. I just assumed you were adjusting okay because nobody called me to say otherwise." "I'm okay now," Dorothy assured her. "Better than okay, actually. I've found community here. I've found purpose. This has actually turned into a good place for me." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "The woman in that news segment," she finally said, "that woman looked alive and vibrant and engaged. That's the mom I remember from before Dad died. I'm glad you found your way back to yourself." After the call ended, Dorothy sat with Rachel's words. She realized her daughter was right. She had found her way back to herself. Not to who she was before Thomas died or before the Parkinson's diagnosis or before moving to Maple Grove. She had found her way to a new version of herself. A version that had been tested and broken and rebuilt. A version that knew her own strength and worth. A version that refused to be diminished by circumstance or age or illness. The attention from the television segment brought unexpected opportunities. A music therapy organization contacted Patricia Vance asking if Dorothy would be interested in speaking at their annual conference about her experience. A local university invited her to share her story with students studying gerontology. A publishing company reached out asking if she would consider working with a writer to turn her story into a book. Dorothy declined most of these invitations. She was not interested in becoming a professional inspirational speaker or a celebrity. She just wanted to play piano for her friends at Maple Grove and live her life in peace. But she did agree to speak at the music therapy conference because she believed in the power of music to heal and wanted to support that work. The conference was held at a hotel in Boston, about an hour's drive from Maple Grove. Patricia Vance personally drove Dorothy there, with Agnes and Harold coming along for support. The conference hall was filled with several hundred music therapists, psychologists, and healthcare workers. Dorothy stood at the podium, hands trembling. She told the music therapy conference about losing everything, being told she was too old, and fighting back. The audience stood and applauded through tears. 6 months later, Maple Grove had transformed. Daily concerts became tradition. Other residents joined in. Frank sang, Margaret led a choir. The facility secured funding after families chose Maple Grove specifically for its music program. Dorothy's health stabilized. Her Parkinson's progression slowed. Rachel visited more, bringing the grandchildren who now admired their grandmother's strength. On the 1-year anniversary, Patricia organized a celebration. Dorothy spoke from her heart about never being too old to matter, to fight for joy, to refuse invisibility. She played an original composition called Finding Home, telling her journey through music. From despair to hope, darkness to light. The room erupted in applause. That night, Dorothy wrote to Thomas, thanking him for teaching her piano, the gift that ultimately saved her. She told him she missed him but was truly living again. The next morning, she played alone before breakfast. Not for an audience, but for herself. Because making music was as essential as breathing. Because at 78 with trembling hands, she had proven everyone wrong. She had learned that resilience meant creating meaning despite pain. That community existed in unlikely places. That fighting for happiness was necessary, not selfish. Most importantly, that she was never too old to become who she was meant to be. As other residents filtered in, Dorothy placed her shaking hands on the keys and began to play. This was home now, not because of the building, but because she had made it so by refusing to accept anything less than a life worth living. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.